And it's kind of meant to be an informative event where you learn what it's like to be conducting research and and exploring cutting edge technology in the biomed field. Um, and sometimes how it starts with getting a position at a lab, be that at UofT or other schools. We ask that you please hold your questions until the very end because we have set aside time for that. And without further ado, I'm just going to get started with the slides. As we would have with an in-person gathering on campus, we do want to start by devoting some time to our land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. And we understand that over the past year now, we've had to adapt to an entirely new lifestyle. And for many of us, that's meant returning to home abroad. But in this time, we've kind of all benefited and continue to benefit from the downtown UofT campus and community. So we'd like to take this opportunity to recognize that as well as to recognize our privilege. So during this quarantine, we've not had to experience hardships in the way that many others have. And so we should keep that in mind and take action to support them as much as we are able. So let's dive into this wayfinding panel with feelings of compassion, connection, and gratitude. So today's event, we're just going to quickly breeze through this agenda. We're gonna talk a little bit about UT BIOME, the club that we all belong to, and then introduce our amazing speakers, hear about some of their work as well as their experiences, and then have a question period where you can ask them about their work, their labs, whatever you feel like. So UT BIOME is a multidisciplinary undergrad design team, and we aim to better the health of individuals in need while facilitating the exposure of undergrad students to the biomedical engineering industry. We aim to achieve these goals by choosing high-impact projects focused on the research, design, prototyping, and testing phases of product development. And this provides a hands-on environment for undergrad students to learn and apply their knowledge. We also hold training workshops and lecture events like this one to supplement the University of Toronto's biomedical engineering curriculum. And I realized I made a blunder and forgot to introduce myself. My name is Khadija, and I'm the co-managing director of this wonderful organization. And that's that. I'm gonna pass this on to Shreya, and then Shreya, if you could just introduce our guests, starting with Miranda.
Yeah, for sure. So just to introduce myself first, my name is Shreya and I'm the Director of Outreach for UT BIOME. And so starting with our speakers, first up we have Miranda Carleton. Her undergraduate degree was in engineering science at the University of Toronto. Currently, she is a PhD candidate in Dr. Michael Sefton's lab, and her research focuses on creating novel therapeutics for repair of traumatic skeletal muscle injuries that would normally not heal on their own. So I would like to give the mic to Miranda.
Hello, everyone. So as Shreya said, I'm a PhD candidate in Professor Michael Sefton's lab. So our lab focuses on regenerative biomaterials. So materials for tissue engineering and regenerative medicine, and I work mostly in the space of skeletal muscle. So you guys are interested in working in the lab. First thing I would say is every lab experience is different. I come from, it's a biology/chemical engineering lab. So we do mostly chemistry work, cell work, and animal work. Many other labs will just focus on one of those, or maybe they're more computer-based. So whatever I'm saying, it applies to wet lab work with cells in animals mostly. I don't do many like computational modeling or anything like that. So I started at the Sefton lab as a master's student in September of 2016, and then I bypassed into my PhD program. So for those of you who don't know, in Canada, many universities allow you to enter as a master's right out of undergrad, and then after a year, you can, if your supervisor and your committee agrees, you can go directly and become a second-year PhD student. So basically enables you to skip your master's. And when you're doing this, usually your PhD takes around 5 years, I would say minimum. That's what I did. And I'm gonna defend my PhD now in May of this year. So you can see I'm on that like 5-year time frame. So I got the position just through emailing Professor Sefton. He taught me a course in undergrad. And so I emailed him, and I had, at the time when I was applying, I was working in another professor's lab, Professor Alison McGugan, and she had done her PhD with Professor Sefton. So there was that little connection on the side that got me like an interview. And then after the interview, he accepted me as a master's student. So currently, I would say my work pre-COVID, it involves a mix between writing and performing experiments. When you first enter into your master's or your PhD, it's more a lot of like reading and designing your experiments and trying to figure out what your project is, and then creating a plan for each of your aims, and then what experiments are going to go along to answer the questions or the hypotheses that you came up with. So after all that planning phase is done, you mostly are fully in the lab doing research. It's not 9 to 5, it's whatever hours your experiments need. So if you're doing a time point that's like every 12 hours, you can think like if you're doing it at 10 a.m., then you may have to come in at 12 p.m. So it all is like you schedule everything yourself. And after then you work a couple years and you get a year or two and you get enough research, you then may be more moved into like writing your first paper. So you may be more working at a desk or working from home, writing up your paper, and that's done. You may go back to working in the lab. So in my experience, I've had phases of heavy lab work and then take a step back, write that up into some kind of deliverable, and then go back into the lab and to your next stage of your project. What else there is to say? I think that's it. I don't know if there's any other questions the organizers want me to answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I would just like to know, so so when you directly go into PhD, do you still get a master's, or do you just get that one PhD degree if you bypass your master's, or do you kind of do like your master's project throughout your PhD? So is it like 2 projects, or is it just one continuation?
It's just one continuation. So you can like, I will say this all again for like Canadian universities and specifically like U of T, though I think other Canadian universities are similar. The States is different, but in Canada, you don't even need your master's to get a PhD if the professor agrees with you that you're capable of going from like an undergrad to a PhD. If you have 0 lab experience, which may be the case now because of COVID, and I know like a lot of labs are canceled, it's really hard to get that lab experience unless you are in grad school and ready doing the research, then like maybe necessary that you want to learn, get your master's, and then get your PhD. I had a lot of a lab experience, but I didn't want to go and do a direct PhD because I wasn't sure if the Sefton lab was like I didn't know right away like what did I want to do for my research. So I came in a year, did first year master's, and then said I like this project, I like this lab, I like the supervisor, I want to stick with it. But then when you bypass to your PhD, you completely, like, that 1 year of master's becomes 1 year of PhD. So you never end up getting your master's, which is fine, because if you have the PhD, the master's is not really necessary, at least in this field. If you're in the States, though, they don't offer the bypass, and then a lot of PhD programs require a master's. So it really is specific on the university and the lab you're applying to.
Okay, I see. And I'm just curious, did you have research experience after your first year, so in the summer of first year? And if not, like, can people who are who just have 1 year of university experience, probably not a lot of knowledge about biomedical in general, are they able to get research positions?
Well, I'll answer your first part of your question first. So with my research experience for, I think, let me think back, it was such a long time. After my the summer of my third year, I worked in a lab, just assisting a master's student with some research. I got mostly cell culture experience and 1 or 2 assays. I didn't produce anything that was like publishable. And then for my fourth year, I did a thesis. So it was like 1 year research based. And that then extended into also a summer opportunity, because the lab got funding. And so I had that research experience, which is more me creating my own project from like start to finish. And that was something that ended up being publishable. So it was with that experience that I was able to come and like start working right away in the lab. That's not saying that if you have 0 research experience, you can't do it. It's more about just talking with the professor whose lab you want to join and seeing what they're comfortable with taking. If they're, they want someone they can train from like no experience right to, being a great PhD student, or they only have projects in which you need to come in fully trained. So that again is like very professor, I think, orientated, but the majority of PhD students do come in with some experience.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. We will now move on to our next speaker. So her name is Shirley Chung. Her undergraduate degree is a Bachelor of Science, Biotechnology Specialization at University of Waterloo. Currently, she's a master's candidate in the Santerre Lab, and her research focus is to develop a delivery system for neonatal stem cell secretomes as a potential regenerative therapy for heart failure. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Shirley.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. So I'm Shirley. So I'm in the Santerre Lab. I'm in my first year here, and I did my undergrad in Waterloo in a Bachelor's of Science. So it's actually in a life science program, so might be a little different than a lot of you guys here. I think most of you are probably in engineering degree, right? Yeah, so I came from a little bit of a different background, so it was a little bit of a shift going to a graduate program that's focused on biomedical engineering. But my undergrad program, it was a co-op program, so I got to get a lot of experience from that. One of the placements was actually, I was working in Dr. Molly Shoichet's lab, and that's where I met Shreya before. So that was one of my first research experiences, and it was a really good exposure to kind of the UofT community and research here. And then from there, I was working at the Santerre Lab the following summer, so that was 2019, I want to say 2019 summer. And from there, I really liked the lab here and everything they were researching. I really liked TBEP. So TBEP is the Translational Biology and Engineering program that they have in the Mars building that's connected to UofT. So this program, I really liked it, and I liked how it was very, very collaborative. So I decided to come back for my master's for this program. Yeah, so for my master's project, like Shreya mentioned, so my project is collaborating with a lab that's sick kids. So one of the doctors there, his name's Dr. Maines, his lab is working on like proteomics and proteins. So what they've discovered is that sometimes like in cardiac stem cells, they secrete certain proteins, right? So that was what they called the secretomes. So they secrete certain proteins that are beneficial and help regenerate the heart. So what my project is to develop a delivery vehicle. So it could be in the form of like nanoparticles or scaffolds, just to deliver those beneficial components to the heart tissue. So yeah, a little bit about my experience so far. So I started this year, which was, the best time to start anything. So it's been a little interesting. I've been really lucky because I worked here, like I mentioned, a previous summer ago. So I kind of knew the ins and outs a little bit before kind of just going in like cold turkey. But it's definitely been an interesting transition to grad school. The hours are a little funny, like I'm at Mars right now, just because we're working at like 50% capacity. So sometimes you'll come in earlier in the day, sometimes you'll come in later in the day, but it's honestly not too different from how hours would be for regular grad school because you're not looking at a 9 to 5 anyways. You are coming in sometimes on the weekend, sometimes in the evenings, depending kind of what your experiments need. So it hasn't been, I don't think it's been as dramatic of a change as something like undergrad where all your courses are shifted online and you don't have in-person labs anymore. Yeah, I think, okay, so one tip that I can kind of talk about, or not really a tip, but kind of what I noticed from an change from undergrad to grad school that I kind of wish someone would have told me was that it's really different in terms of your schedule. So like in undergrad, I feel like everything's very structured and you're kind of told you have class, 9 a.m. and then you're gonna go to the lab at 12 and then you maybe like grab a bite and then meet up with your friends. It's very structured, right? And you kind of know like, oh, once the semester starts, you're like, okay, in February, I'll have this midterm on this day and then this midterm on that day and then exams April. And then it's like, you're like, okay, April's done. And then you're like, I can relax for a couple of months or I can do an internship. But I feel like with grad school, it's a lot more up to you. So you have to take the initiative of advancing your project. You have to make those experiments, present that data to your supervisors because they might not always be kind of asking for updates. You have to provide that to them and ask those questions, or else your project is kind of sometimes just at a standstill. So I think if you're like a person that really likes having that independence, taking that initiative, I think you can really thrive kind of in this environment. Yeah, I don't know if you have any other questions for me at all.
Yeah, actually I have one question for you. So how do you go about applying for a master's? Is there like a form to fill out? Do you just email as many professors as you can? Is there a specific one that you have to email? And how does the whole process work?
Yeah, so I believe there is a formal application process at UofT for biomedical engineering, but they recommend you to kind of secure a supervisor before doing that formal application process, so that when you're applying, you can already kind of say which supervisor has taken you on or agreed to take you on for the following fall semester. But it is initially a lot of kind of like cold emailing. So I had worked in the Santerre lab as a summer student. So we had that connection already, and he knew there was a project that kind of matched my interest. So we kind of branched off of that. But even before I had agreed to take on this position, myself and Dr. Santerre were open to me kind of exploring if there was other labs that maybe I was more interested in. And to talk to those labs, it was really just like cold emailing. So you just kind of email a professor you're interested in, kind of mention why you're interested, talk about the experience you have, and then ask if they're kind of accepting any students. And usually like the professors are pretty responsive, and when you kind of express that you have an interest in their lab.
Okay. Thank you for that. And also, I know you just started your master's degree, but even from your previous research experiences, what are kind of like some of the deliverables that you have to submit or talk about to your professor? And are they like weekly deliverables, or are they more like monthly? How does that work?
Yeah. I think as like an undergrad student in the summer, typically you would be like working under a graduate student or like a postdoc. So postdocs they already have their PhDs. So you would typically report to them, and that's kind of based on a schedule that you set. Mostly, I would say about like weekly, just because you do require a lot of guidance when you're still in your undergrad doing research. So kind of weekly, it could be more often if you need it, and then you just kind of set that up with the grad student you're working with. I would say like as a grad student, well, just how my lab functions is that we kind of do weekly updates to our profs just in a lab meeting, and you kind of just give them the rundown and kind of like what I did last week, what I'm planning to do this week, any like major experiments you want to do. But doesn't mean that you have to present kind of like tangible data every week. That's more in like separate meetings that you can set aside and just like kind of let your prof know like, hey, I have some like big experiments I just kind of wrapped up. Like, do you want to talk about some data? And you can kind of like set a time aside like to yourself and just like sit down with the prof for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Shirley. It was really informative.
No problem.
Okay, so for our next speaker, we have Alicia Chen. Her undergraduate degree was in chemical engineering at UofT. Currently, she is a fourth-year thesis student at the Shoichet Lab, but she also worked as a previous summer student at the same lab, and her research focus is formulating non-covalently linked hydrogels for 3D cell structure and cell delivery. So I'm going to pass it over to Alicia.
Hi guys, just wanted to make sure you guys can hear me. And currently I'm at the lab. I'm outside the lab. And if you hear any background noise from my end, that's because this entire building is being cleaned, and I apologize in advance for any of the noise that you may hear throughout this presentation. So, like I said before, my name is Alicia, and I'm a chemical engineering student, and I had a bioengineering minor here at UT. And like Shirley mentioned, was a summer student here in my second year of summer, so back in 2018. And then I'm currently working here as a thesis student. Both are different projects. So back in 2018, my project was on formulating colloidal drug aggregates. And then this year was more so focused on the biomaterials, so synthesizing non-covalently linked hydrogels that would be better for cell culture and scaffolding, essentially. And one second, just checking. At the time, my two application processes were actually kind of similar, and also given that I work in the same lab, I already know like people from the lab, so it was a bit easier to ask around to see if they do have an opening for either a thesis student or a summer student. So at the time of my application, I reached out both ways. So I looked on the faculty website to see if any of the professors in their research area interested me. And then second, usually departments, they hold like events, like for example, at ChemEng, we have, I'm trying to recall the name. I think it's called Research Day. So essentially, professors who are looking to hire both thesis students as well as summer students, they'll come to these events and present their projects that is available and open. And then essentially after that, you can start emailing them from there, or you can just like cold emailing, telling them about your interest and see if there will be a possibility for a match. And then after that, I went through a interview process with some of the grad students of the lab, and then essentially that's to see if your interest and your skill sets align with theirs, and also to see if your personality aligns, which means that you would work essentially nicely together with each other. One second. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry, cut out for a second. And then essentially after the interview, I did get Um, Please let me know if you hear too much background noise. I'll try to speak into the microphone more. And then essentially after the interview, I was selected because his project was highly relevant to something I worked on the previous summer at Professor Costas' lab, but that's more so on surfactants and colloids, which is not relevant to, like, I suppose, biomedical application as of now. And then after that, thesis application went pretty much the same way. And then something I would say that really helped me was, especially in your communication for you to get your project, to know that what exactly you're looking for. For example, when I got my thesis project this year, I stated very clearly to my supervisor that I really wanted to do some cell work because from a chemical engineering degree, I don't get much of that experience. Literally, the only cells that I've worked for was in, I think it was a course, and it had like these labs, and it was like I only worked with them for 2 hours out of an entire semester and my entire degree before I started working here. But now, knowing that that's my interest, and he agreed to provide me with those training, I was able to start essentially like the kind of work I have been really looking forward to be doing. So that's very exciting and motivating personally for me. Other than that, something else that I found really great, especially working as an undergrad in like a big lab, is talking to people as much as you can and asking a lot of questions. I'm pretty sure when Shirley and I, when we were at the same lab, because I was so blank in like anything like really bio related. Even like my project then was more so like, it was like formulations and stuff, it was more like chem. But I'm pretty sure I asked her a lot of questions, and I asked a lot of questions to a lot of people around me because I wanted to know about the projects. I want to know about like how certain things work. And I feel like that really, first, everybody's super nice, and they're really willing to provide you with guidance and with advice. And, you know, they're willing to enlighten you. And at the same time, I feel like you also develop a really great connection, also like a support network around you, which is, I think, particularly helpful under like this kind of environment when you don't really get to step outside other than going to the lab. And something else that I think would also be beneficial is, for example, before my first interview with at the Shoichet Lab for my summer position, I actually knew some of the grad students working there. So essentially through that connection, I was able to probe around and ask to see if I could get an interview at all to start with. So I think that's that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alicia. That was really informative. I just have a couple questions for you. So what is one challenge that you would say that you faced, and like how did you overcome it, in terms of, it could be like in your research project, it could be while finding a position, anything.
I would say the biggest challenge was knowing when to give up, because it's essentially like for a thesis project or for some project, you only have 4 to 8 months, or like maybe longest to a year if you start training this summer to begin or finish your project. And there are just certain limitations or stuff that you don't know about, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. Like the results didn't seem to make any sense, and it just doesn't seem promising to head down that direction, especially in this limited time frame. So with that being said, I would say that when you do feel like you're kind of heading into a direction that you don't know what's waiting ahead of you, especially from your current results, it seems like it's not going to yield you anything. I think just do one more repeated try, and then communicate that with your supervisor and see if there is an alternative focus that you can alternate to, instead of heading down that one way that you probably can't come back. So
awesome. Yeah, that's really good advice for sure. And also, maybe what is one tip that you would give? I know you just gave a tip right now, but maybe another tip that you would like to give students who are maybe just starting out, maybe who are in first year and are really kind of getting into research, just learning more about it, because this is very different from, I would say, like high school or even what they teach in first year. I think as far as in ChemEng, we didn't even go into the lab in first year. It started from second year. So what is kind of one tip that you would like to give to them?
I feel like to never be afraid of like that you're a blank piece of paper, because you are, especially like younger, like I suppose like I went into both of my summer and technically this one as well with not a lot of background knowledge, but you need to believe that you will be trained and you're smart enough to learn everything during these 4 or 8 or however long that you're working in the lab, that you can do it. And also, if you're someone like, I personally think I'm not like, I like to ask a lot of questions, and I need to get that confirmation from my supervisor that I'm doing okay and that I'm not like going into a completely like not correct direction for my project.
Yeah.
So I'm personally the type that I chat a lot with my supervisor. So to like, I feel like maybe not to 1 second, sorry. I felt like maybe just to know that you're not bugging them, like this is part of their duty and they care to know about your project. I think that's what I would say.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alicia. I think your tips and whatever you said is really, really important to everyone who's here. So thank you so much for that. So next up, we have Karl Wagner, whose undergraduate degree was in the Bachelor of Science, Materials Engineering at University of Alberta. He is currently a PhD candidate in the Radisic Lab, and his research focus is studying cell-secreted particles called extracellular vesicles, which are used by cells to communicate with one another. Also studying the role of extracellular vesicles in the initiation of heart damage following a heart attack, as well as the potential to use vesicles secreted by healthy cell cultures as a therapy to repair the damaged heart. Probably a mouthful, but I think he can explain it further, and you guys can obviously ask questions at the end if you have questions about his research. And I think I did make you the co-host, so you can share your screen as you like.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the intro, and thanks for everyone that came before me. You guys introduced the kind of field of research and grad studies really well. So I think maybe I'll take a little bit of a foray more into some stuff about my research and kind of the sphere of biomedical research as a whole, and hopefully get all of you excited about biomedical research and interested in pursuing it later. So I have some slides I can just go through and kind of show you a little bit about what I do and kind of my experience in grad school. So as we've heard, my project is looking at investigating the role and mechanisms of extracellular vesicles in cardiac tissues on a chip. But first I want to just talk a little bit more about me. So I'm from Calgary originally. I grew up there and I was born there. And I did my Bachelor of Science and Master of Engineering, so a course-based master's first in Materials Engineering at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And kind of fun fact about me, I was a varsity track and field athlete at U of A, and currently I'm still training and competing with the UofT track team. Unfortunately, I'm a post-collegiate athlete now. I'm not allowed to compete for the university anymore because I've used all my eligibility, but I run the 400-meter hurdles, so that's fun. So yeah, I am a third-year PhD student in Professor Radisic's lab. And essentially what our lab does is we use stem cells to build these tissue-engineered models of the heart in order to better understand heart disease and find new therapies to regenerate damaged heart tissue. So my actual program is a PhD in chemical engineering, but I'm doing the collaborative specialization in biomedical engineering. And the reason why I chose to do biomedical engineering and specifically a PhD at UofT, there's several kind of reasons that drew me to this program. First of all, I had previous research experience, and so it's great that you're all interested or thinking about applying to research labs in your undergrad, because this is a great time to experience different fields and learn what it's like to do research and work in a lab. And that's really the reason I'm here today, because my background is in materials engineering. But my previous experience, I managed to get lucky and work in some labs that worked with tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, and it made me really curious about the future of this field, because I'm really passionate about translational research. I really like to see, as an engineer, how can the results and the things that I'm doing in the lab directly help people in the hospital and kind of improve health outcomes for people and make life better for people. That's really what drives me, not as much kind of just trying to understand the world in biology, but to really see how we can apply it and help people with it. And I think that's what makes it so exciting to be a biomedical engineer, is because we bring kind of the engineering and practical side to biology. And I'm also really excited about teaching and sharing my interests with other people. And so I don't necessarily know what my final career destination is. Some people come into a PhD saying, I want to do a PhD because I want to be a professor and I want to do this. For me, it was more just that I knew I was interested in this field. And biomedical engineering is still a very specialized field, and there's not a lot of opportunities necessarily in undergrad to become specialized in a lot of these concepts. So for me, it was a chance to learn more and expand my knowledge and kind of learn what was out there and where I could fit into this field moving forward. So I'll give you like a little quick intro to my project. I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to maybe give you a little bit of understanding about what I do and some opportunities in biomedical research. So I'm specifically focusing on the heart. And so currently cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. You can see a stat there, 422 million cases globally in 2015. So that's a lot of people that are affected by heart disease. And usually it's caused by a heart attack, which I'm sure you've heard about. And when you have a heart attack, some of your heart cells will die, and the heart cells don't divide and replace themselves on a meaningful time scale like some of your other tissues do, like say how your skin and your wounds heal. When your heart is injured, it pretty much kind of stays injured for the rest of your life, and you end up with heart failure where your heart can't pump blood properly. So right now, the only real therapy we have is to do a heart transplant, but we're hoping in our lab to discover new regenerative therapies to kind of stimulate this heart tissue to regenerate and repair itself inside the body. And so someone asked a little bit about organ-on-a-chip engineering, one of the attendee questions I saw. And so I want to give you a little overview about what that is, because there's a lot of labs at UofT working on organ-on-a-chip. And so the heart is an organ and it's really difficult to access and study in the body, as you can imagine. Right now, the way we study the heart is usually through 2D cell cultures, just flat cells on a dish, or looking at animal models, so rat hearts, for example. But really, there's problems with both of these, right? Your heart is not a 2D environment. It's a 3D environment with a lot of different cells and different scaffolds and matrix and proteins, everything in there. And in terms of animal models, they're not really accurately representing human physiology. So that's why we have this field called tissue on a chip or organ on a chip engineering, where we're using these microfabrication principles, things like 3D printing and soft lithography, many different principles of kind of engineering, where we're kind of fusing that with biology, and we're combining cells and biomaterials in these 3D environments to mimic human organ structures and processes in the lab. And you can see a video here. This is an organ on a chip model that I made in my lab. It's called the BioWire Human Cardiac Tissue on a Chip. And you can see it's a little piece of beating heart tissue suspended between these two wires. And so we can essentially grow pieces of heart tissue, starting with stem cells. We can turn them into heart cells and then create these beating pieces of heart tissue that we can kind of use to understand how the heart works, but also we can use it. So I mentioned some of the applications here, studying mechanisms of physiology. So understanding how the heart works in the body, disease modeling. So we can kind of simulate a heart attack in this organ on a chip model by maybe growing it in an environment where there's low oxygen supply, and it will cause some of the cells to be damaged. And we'll notice that the beating will be a lot weaker when that happens. So we can kind of use these assessments of our tissues in the lab to understand how maybe tissues in the body would behave and react under stress or disease. And then finally, screening new therapies. So we can add different drugs or different regenerative treatments to these tissues that we've damaged in the lab, and we can see if we can repair them And then the idea is that we can learn a lot more about the heart in the lab, and the human heart specifically in the lab, than we could if we're just studying it in the body. So that's most about my research. I don't want to go too much more into detail about the rest of us because I want to finish off talking a little bit more about grad school. But it was alluded to that I'm working on extracellular vesicles. So essentially, cells in all of your tissues will communicate with one another by either direct cell contact, or by secreting molecules, or by transferring extracellular vesicles. So vesicles, or EVs, they're just membrane-bound particles. And you can see kind of in this image how they work, that are secreted by cells, so they can bud off the cell membrane, or they can come from endosomes inside the cells and be released. And they contain things like proteins and lipids and nucleic acids that can then be transferred to surrounding cells and can act as little messengers to signal the cells to behave differently or to respond somehow. So the idea in my project is that in these BioWire cardiac tissue on a chip models, we have lots of cells inside that are secreting vesicles between each others. And we want to understand more, what is the role of these vesicles in regulating the function, such as the contraction of the heart tissue. And then furthermore, we want to be able to grow these heart tissues, like I mentioned, in a low oxygen environment or in hypoxia. And then secondly, we'll kind of isolate vesicles from these damaged heart tissues and see what happens to vesicle signaling when we've damaged our tissues. And then finally, I'm looking at using vesicles from healthy cells as a regenerative therapeutic. So I talked about how I'll be damaging those BioWire tissues, but then I'll be isolating vesicles from healthy cells grown in like a regular environment and applying them to my damaged tissues and seeing if I can actually kind of signal my damaged tissues to repair and regenerate themselves by almost communicating with them in the language that they normally speak to each other. So that's about my research. And just kind of, I want to finish off talking more about the grad school vein. So some things that I enjoy about grad school and research in general is the flexibility. Like one of the speakers mentioned earlier, we're not working on a schedule like you are in undergrad. I mean, you're kind of working on your own schedule, and you make your own hours, and you work kind of when you want to, and you can do the things that you want to do when you want to do them, which is a really cool experience that you don't get in many other jobs, I find. It's not necessarily like a 9 to 5. It does depend on your lab and your supervisor's preferences, but in my lab, it's definitely very free form. My supervisor is very focused on outcomes. And so she has kind of a set design of the experiments that she wants to do and where she wants the project to go. But really you have the freedom within that to do things and plan your experiments on your own schedule and try the things that interest you. And especially at UofT, I mentioned in the second point, at UofT, we have the funding and the resources and facilities that are top notch really in the world and definitely in Canada. So I always find that if I have an idea, if I think of something or if I see something in a paper, there's no limits for me being able to make that happen. Like the resources are there, the facilities are there. And if I want to try something kind of way out there, I really feel supported in being able to just do that. And it might fail, but it might succeed too. And another great thing about grad school is collaboration. At the U of T, we have a lot of amazing researchers and facilities, like I mentioned, but also abroad. There's a lot of opportunities when you're in grad school to travel, whether it be to conferences or research exchanges. My specific thesis project is a collaborative program working with a group at Columbia University in New York. So I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to take an expenses paid trip to New York, which was awesome. And I spent a week there just working in a lab of Professor Gordana Vunjak-Novakovic, who's really amazing researcher in the biomaterials field, and kind of learn some of their techniques and bring those back to my lab. And those are experiences that are definitely available in abundance to you at U of T and in grad school. And thirdly, I really love the teaching opportunities and TAing. It's a chance to kind of make some extra money on the side and also meet and talk to undergrads, share my passions, and really gain experience in teaching, because that's potentially something I'm interested in doing after grad school. Some things that are challenging about grad school, I mentioned the flexibility and freedom were great, but they also can be very challenging because I'm in charge of my own day-to-day schedule. So your supervisor, depending on their style again, some are more maybe hands-on and more directive. My supervisor is very hands-off and kind of very self-work focused. So she'll give the general guidelines of where she wants her project to go. But within that, you really have to be able to plan your schedule and fill in the experiments kind of to get towards what her outcomes are. And so every professor has a different style, and you just, something to think about when you're looking around at labs is what kind of style do you work best with, especially when you're applying for grad school, but it's also maybe of interest if you're applying for summer research, is talking to senior students in the lab that you're interested in. So I would really recommend reaching out, asking to meet. Many of the students are more than willing to do so and just talk about the style of the lab and how research works there. And it'll give you a really good sense, other than just talking to the professor, about what the lab is like, what the day-to-day is like, and what the projects are like. So that's, I would highly recommend doing that when you're choosing a lab for grad school. And the last thing I want to mention here that's challenging is that your research is going to be novel when you're in grad school, and you might have a lot of questions and you might not be able to find any answers to them on the internet because you may be doing things that no one else has done. And it's okay to just try your best and try something and fail, because the point is, the reason we're here for several years is things don't work out immediately. That's kind of the point of grad school, especially when you're doing something very novel. It's just a process of doing your best. And kind of leading into that, I put some general advice for grad research. Don't be afraid to fail an experiment. So when I started, and I still do this, I would hold off running an experiment until I had read every protocol and every paper about it, and I made the most elaborate plans, and then I would still fail anyway. But like, failed data is still data that can show us progress for you. So it can help demonstrate what you've been doing to your supervisor. And it's really great for your qualifying exam too, to just show you're working and you're trying to optimize things. So I would say my advice is, when you're doing research, don't be afraid to fail and just get started and just try something, even if you don't fully know how to do it or what you're doing. Because I put my example of Western blotting here. I don't know if any of you have done Western blots, but trial one, I wrote down here, I spent 3 months planning and preparing, trying to learn how to do a Western blot. I was so nervous, and there was no one else in my lab that knew how to do it. And so I had to teach myself by watching YouTube tutorials. And I read so many protocols and papers. And the first time I tried it, you can see how ugly it looks. But literally just doing it again a couple weeks later, I came up with a really pretty looking blot. And so really it was a case of like, you could spend months and months reading about something, but at some point it's good to just give it a try, and it's okay to fail and not know exactly how it works. Because sometimes if you just try something more times, you get practice at it and you learn better by doing, I find. And at least I can then show this to my supervisor and say, like, I tried it, didn't work out perfectly, but I have some kind of concrete progress to show to my supervisor and my committee. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's more general stuff, but yeah, just read papers, see what other people are doing in your field. And you don't have to reinvent every aspect of your project. I mean, your project is just a new angle on what already exists. So I take a lot of inspiration when I'm trying new techniques from what other people have done already, and I use their parameters to start with and then optimize my own work from there. I can talk more about qualifying exam if people want to ask questions later, but I'm not sure if that's of interest to you. I also have some videos about what it's like working in a lab. I have some videos about like looking at our lab setup and stuff, so I can go into that later again if people want in the question period, because I don't want to take up so much time. But just kind of some final notes to answer your questions that were submitted. I hopefully covered organ-on-chip research decently. Someone asked about what background knowledge you need. I come from a materials engineering background, so I had no kind of solid biology background or things like microfabrication. I didn't know anything about that. And I wouldn't stress too much about that, because as an engineer, you're coming into this degree with a lot of kind of problem solving know-how and practical know-how. And so that will serve you really well in learning the things you need to learn. And I would say, don't be afraid if you feel like you don't know much about what you're doing. If you're excited about it and the field sounds interesting to you, that's what matters more than what you already know or don't know about it, because you'll be able to learn. And I was the same way. And Toronto is really the best place to be for biotech. So this is like the future of medicine, and it's really exciting that you're interested in it. And I think that this is the perfect time and place to be. So I would really encourage you to, if you see professors' work that interests you, I would kind of go on the faculty websites for the different engineering departments or the biomed department, even at different schools, and just read about the professors and read about the short blurbs about what their research is. And if you're interested in one, don't be afraid to reach out, because sending that email is how you start making that connection. Even if you feel like you don't have experience, or maybe they're a really renowned professor and you feel kind of self-conscious or nervous, reaching out is the best place to start, and just talking about your interests and your experiences, sending a resume or CV possibly. That's really the way to get these summer positions and these grad school positions. And even if you're a first year student, I'd say it's worth seeing what roles are out there. I mean, I worked with a second year summer student a couple of years ago that had no research experience beforehand, but he ended up being an amazing asset to our lab. And it's such a good kickoff starting experience for you, and it can really open doors. A lot of the students that spoke earlier talked about how they worked in one lab for the summer, and then that same professor has maybe hired them back for grad school or got them new connections to other labs. So I would highly recommend just seeing what's out there, seeing what research people are doing by looking at the faculty websites, and kind of going through the research summary blurbs of different professors. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, because I've taken up a lot of time, but thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions after this.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Karl. That was awesome. It was an amazing presentation, very informative. And yeah, thank you so much for all the information. And also thank you so much to all the speakers that have spoken so far. It was a great experience to just hear about your experiences, hear about what you guys do, and just know more about research in general. So now I'm going to open the floor up to questions. So feel free to use the chat, or you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Are you able to see my? Oh, Jenny has her hand up.
Hi, first of all, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. I wanted to ask, what do you think the ideal research student looks like for a prof, and kind of what advices would you give for someone starting in a research lab to do well?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think each one of us here will have a different answer to that question, because every single prof is looking for different things in their grad students, depending on what their previous experiences are and what type of research that they want done. I would think one of the things that you need to have for sure in every lab, and I think Karl kind of pointed to this at the end, is you need to have a willingness to fail and then just keep going, and being able to work through those problems to come to the end of the project. One of the big things, I would say.
That's really helpful. Is there any specific things for your lab in as well that you'd like to point out, and then we could go in order and get insight about each of your specific labs, because all of you come from really big big ones.
In terms of undergrad students applying, I would say Professor Sefton has always been very lenient with them, because students are meant for learning. They're not even PhD students, like you're a student first and foremost. So the whole process is about you learning. So if you come in with a little experience, that is not a bad thing. It's mostly his decision base has always been on, is there a project that he has that you're interested in, right? There needs to be a match there. And then is there a grad student who's able to be there to mentor you along the way? So if all three of those things match, then it's great. There's a good opportunity for you to come into the lab. And then as for a PhD student, it's usually you have some like a set of experiences that would need you to be like just do basic research. But I think it's a mystery. I'm going to say how he hires his grad student. I don't know for certain. I think like there was a lot to say with like you have the certain type of technical skills. Are you going to be able to fit into the lab and fit into the environment? Because that's very important, like in any job. Are you going to be able to, as I said, work very independently and bring a project from start to end and work through the problems to get there?
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you so much. How about Karl, Shirley, and then Alicia? We can just go in that order.
Sure. I mean, Miranda covered it pretty well, but I think to jump on the second part of Jenny's question, kind of what are some ways when you're starting out to kind of establish yourself? I mentioned already in my presentation, but professors, at least my supervisor, like to see results. And they don't always know, because they're often working in their office, right, in a very different environment. They don't always know what you're doing day to day. And so if you're struggling, if you're working long hours and you're working really hard, they don't necessarily know that. And so they need to see kind of what's going on. So like I said, try stuff, fail, but like produce figures, even if your experiment doesn't work, make a graph and show that. And like, if your cells turn out horribly or they die, like take pictures. And it's great. Every presentation, when I have a check-in meeting with my supervisor, I just make a PowerPoint. So if you do an experiment and you take pictures or you make a graph, put it immediately into a PowerPoint presentation. And you can bring that up when you have a meeting with your supervisor, and you can really concretely show what you've been doing and the struggle you've been having. And not only does that show your progress and kind of give them confidence in your work and your process, but it can also help them kind of troubleshoot with you on any problems you might be having and overcoming those challenges. So I would say really kind of like finding ways to concretely show what you're doing can be really helpful with your supervisor-student relationship.
For sure. Thank you so much for the insight.
Hi, I was wondering if I could go first, just because I feel like my laptop is about to die.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead, Alicia.
I really agree with what everybody already said, and I feel like it's really important to make sure you're communicating everything rather timely. So one way of really effectively communicating is, of course, through presentation, like what Karl said, and also I feel like it's really important to just keep them in the loop of what you're doing, to know that you're on the right track, so that you're not kind of MIA for like, I don't know, a couple days, couple weeks. And also to make sure that you're proactively reaching out, because especially when you work in a lab with a lot of people, it's really important that you reach out to get attention from your supervisors, so that they're not like looking to find you after a lot of stuff that is already on their plate. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thanks, Alicia.
Yeah, I think I was gonna say the whole not being scared to fail thing, but I feel like we've heard that. So I think for me, what's really important in my lab, or kind of what I've seen around, is to not be afraid to ask for help when you have a question or an issue. Well, especially because like, you know, I'm in my first year of grad school. There's people here that are much more senior than me, people on the floor, even not in my lab, or just in other labs as well. Just there's so many resources and people that know so much more than you know. So never be afraid to kind of ask for help, kind of like my kind of like theory, or not theory, but you know, motto is like, why spend, you know, a bunch of time doing one thing when you could just ask a question and someone can give you the answer there, right? It's like they've already spent that time kind of investigating that problem, and they could just help you if you just ask them. So don't be afraid to kind of ask those questions. And I feel like as an undergrad in a lab, when you're able to ask those questions and like build those connections, it kind of shows to the prof that kind of you're like, you are passionate, you're interested, and you kind of are willing to take that like initiative to solve the issues on your own. And I think talking more about like how what your profs kind of like want, or like what you would see as like an ideal candidate. I think one thing that I found helped me a lot was to not be afraid to get involved with other people's like projects in the lab. Like if other people have questions or help and they ask you, like don't say no, you know, like it's if opportunities present themselves as an undergrad, like jump on that. Don't be afraid of being like, oh no, maybe I'm not qualified enough, like why are they asking me, like oh my god, I'm so scared to help out. Just kind of jump on that. Like if you know they asked you, they think that you're good enough to help out, and they want your help, then take those opportunities, because they're not always there. So if they are there, try to take advantage of them as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Right, and the other person that has their hand, thank you so much. And the other person that has their hand up is Justmeet. So Justmeet, why don't you ask your question next?
Hi. First of all, I'd just like to thank you guys for what you guys had to say. That was really, really helpful. And I'm currently like a chemical engineering undergraduate, like in second year. And I'm honestly looking for lab positions for the summer, and like, you know, I'm trying to get that experience, but it's like, I'm kind of like, I haven't really had, because of COVID-19, I basically did my whole year online. So I didn't really get that like experience of that hands-on lab, like, you know, like to this extent, I guess you could say, to this like, of this caliber. I haven't had that type of experience. So I guess like when applying for these positions and like reaching out to these professors, like what's a good way in like trying to show them that you would be like a good potential candidate, and you would like, you know, you are someone like worthwhile, like in the situation that like, you know, you haven't had as much experience as you probably should have to be able to work in like a lab. So yeah, like I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. I think profs right now, especially because of COVID, are pretty kind of understanding of the fact that a lot of people don't have very recent kind of hands-on experience. And I feel, at least from what I've seen, profs are pretty open with kind of taking students for kind of non-traditional roles. Like you might not be able to get as much lab experience as you could have, you know, as a summer student in maybe 2019, 2018, but it doesn't mean that you can't get involved in the lab still. So I think if you know, kind of express your interest in the lab, I think if you kind of, it's important to express that you're open to other experiences too. Like maybe it might be doing like more like a literature review, more of the paperwork side, or helping with like a computational side, just because it might be difficult to get you into the lab because of like personnel restrictions because of COVID. I think expressing that you're interested in getting involved in the lab in any way might be a way to kind of like still make that connection. Because I think at the end of the day, what's important is making that connection with the prof, networking with the lab, on top of obviously getting hands-on experience.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, like it's just like that like networking aspect too, I feel like really got affected with this whole COVID-19 thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, how am I gonna network with you on Zoom? But you know, that's definitely like, I guess like there's other ways, like emailing, reaching out, like going to certain events. That could probably be a good way to network.
Yeah. I was gonna say, second what Shirley said, I think the undergraduate students that we brought in for during COVID has been like an alternative role of more doing like a literature review and helping a grad student out with that. So maybe even including like, I'm open to alternative positions. It may let them know like, oh, okay, they don't just want the lab work, they want something else. That may be helpful.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, those are great points. And adding on to that, like I know my one summer student that I had a couple years ago ended up working with Professor McGuigan's lab this past summer, and mostly working from home, but he was doing image analysis of kind of some cell and tissue culture images through ImageJ. And so if you have interest still in a professor's research and you've read about their projects, I would definitely highlight what you're interested in about their projects and why that interests you, because that kind of shows that you know what they're doing, and yeah, being open to alternative roles, and using kind of your experience in other ways. So if you don't have the lab experience, for example, you have some basic programming knowledge, and so that can definitely come in handy for stuff like image analysis. So I would say don't lose heart. There's definitely ways you can find research experience even this summer. And I think it just goes to being open to different things and being kind of knowing what you're interested in and doing your research into the different professors for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
One more thing to add, I like how Karl said, like in your email, be specific on like the research of the prof. Don't send generic emails out, because profs are really busy and you don't just want to be sending a mass email that's kind of vague, like, oh, I love your research, but not actually saying what specifics about the research do you like and how you see yourself a part of the lab. So you want to keep it concise, but also very detailed, so they know that you put the effort to research that.
For sure. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
All right, open to other questions.
Hey, sorry, I just had a quick question about just in terms of like, say you're in like later years of your undergrad, and you're looking for like research positions that can help you with grad school. How important is it that like you have previous research experience in order to get a new one?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps to have previous research experience for sure, but everyone's going to have to start somewhere. So I would recommend like don't feel like you'll be held back by not having experience, because eventually you're going to have to get that first experience. And like I can't remember who else mentioned that, but one of the other students mentioned how supervisors kind of are looking to teach. Maybe that was Miranda. How like the supervisors, that's their job there, is to teach students, right? So they don't expect you to be an expert. And so I think if you come with passion, you come with interest, and you reach out to supervisors, like kind of showing how you're specifically interested in their work, they'll be receptive. Someone will be receptive, and there's not always positions for everybody, but I would say don't let that kind of scare you away from reaching out and giving it a try, because everyone is looking for new students to develop, and especially as summer students or thesis students, those are really great students to have, because they can stay on and do a graduate degree with the professor later. So I would say you have a very good position as an undergrad looking for a research job, because the expectations aren't that you're an expert. And you have kind of the benefit of possibly staying around for more years. I don't know if some of the other panelists have some input too, but.
I was gonna say, before grad school, I got the majority of my research, like actual most learning from my thesis I did. So I was in a program at UofT that required us to do a full year thesis. So I know some engineering programs like EngSci, at least when I was there, required a full like 2-semester thesis program, or at least 1 semester or 2 semesters, depending on what you want to do. And while other programs, you can optionally do 1 or 2 semesters. And that I found was a great way, because it is like a course you're dedicating fully to do this. And professors know that it is a part of these undergraduate programs that they need to get this research experience. So they know, like, oh, I should be accepting some thesis students. And there's also kind of more of a structured program to that. Like, there is going to be some deliverables that your department requires that may be an easier transition between like undergraduate, which is very structured, and graduate school, which is like zero structure. So I found the thesis was like a happy medium to help with that transition. So if you have that opportunity, that was something I found that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, just to add on one little thing, I think, like we mentioned, like kind of like cold emailing a couple of times. I think that's surprisingly something that kind of worked out pretty well for me. And like, it's kind of surprising because it kind of seems like it's not, you know, your traditional way of applying to jobs, right? And it may feel a little silly sometimes when you kind of just don't hear back any response from profs. It's a little discouraging, but just kind of don't be scared to kind of keep emailing, because not the same prof, you know, don't bother them like 10 times, but I mean, like, don't be afraid to keep emailing other profs. Like, I find that sometimes, say you're going to email like 5 profs and you're about to give out a 4, like the 5th one might have been the one that would have taken you. So I think just keep trying and put effort into those emails. I like to attach like my CV on there just so they have everything they need to look at if they are considering you. But yeah, just keep trying with those emails. I think that's the best way of reaching profs.
I'm also going to say cold emailing was a skill that I found to be useful even during grad school. Like, there are sometimes, and I think Karl brought this up in his presentation, like his project is very collaborative, right? And he has this collaboration that's set up. For me, I came to a part of my project when I wanted to do this experiment that I didn't have the equipment or the expertise to do. And I researched with my prof and said, do you have anyone in your network that has the expertise? And he was like, no. So that at that point, I had to start cold emailing profs at UofT and be like, hey, are you open to this collaboration? And it worked out, like, was successful. Like, profs, that's a part of the collaboration in science is so big because they know that's how they also expand. So just breaking that, if you're nervous about it, just doing it more often to get yourself used to it and making the idea not seem as scary, you know, it's good. Like, this is a way to practice that, and just like, it's normal. People receive cold emails all the time. It's fine.
Totally. Like, imposter syndrome is such a thing in grad school. I mean, even before, when you're looking for research positions and have to email profs, and then when you start research and you're having to do this novel work, you're definitely at some point going to feel like you're not qualified to do what you're doing. But like Miranda and Shirley said, this is kind of how it is, and like, everyone experiences that, and people may seem like they're qualified or know what they're doing, but everyone's in the same boat in a lot of ways. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there, because you belong there for sure. And like, we've all gone through that same thing, and we didn't know what we were doing either, so it's okay.
Thank you.
Incredibly sweet. If nobody, I have one small question, and then I think we can wrap it up, unless other people have questions. If you have a question, you speak up now. 3, 2, I can't do fingers. 1. Okay. My question has to do with something kind of all of you briefly touched on in your presentation. I think the first time I kind of heard it was in Alicia's presentation, where she was saying how like, you have to know when to stop, and other things that I heard kind of echoed throughout were these issues of kind of boundaries, almost, where your prof is expecting results and you do so much work, but like, the prof doesn't necessarily see that. So like, how do you navigate that relationship where, like, I know there's a little bit of a power thing where you have your prof who's kind of in charge of the vision for your project and like kind of like your success in your career, but you also have a life. So how do you balance that, and what recommendations do you have for us?
I have something I was going to say.
Yeah.
Even before you enter a lab, one of the questions you should ask either the professor and or the grad students is like so first you have to ask the supervisor like what the supervision style is, and also the grad students. So you want to know like, is your supervisor very hands-on? Like, what are the lab meeting schedules? What's the communication within the lab? Every lab is different. You just need to ask the proper questions to get that. And then from there, you'll figure out like, what's the style of the supervisor. So my supervisor's style is very hands-off. Unless you go to him for help, he will let you do whatever you want. But his door is literally always open. So then if you need the help, you just have to go walk in and be like, hey, do you have time to chat? Or do you want to book a meeting? So it's just about finding out what the supervisor wants from you. So does he want you to go and like weekly show him your results, or is he okay with just you coming to him whenever you want? So
then is it your job to kind of just give them what they want? Doesn't matter. Like, is there a negotiation at all that you could?
I mean, for me, it was simply like my supervisor, as long as I was succeeding, he didn't expect, like, I didn't have to do anything that I didn't want to do because it was all on me. He was like, whatever you feel like, do you want to have weekly meetings? We can do that. You want to have no meetings? You can do that. Whatever you want. You can work 9 to 5, or if you want to be nocturnal and you want to work from like start your day at 6 p.m. and work it through the night, you can do that. It was completely whatever you want to do that makes you the most productive. Just at the end, show me that you produce results. But it's different. Some supervisors aren't like that at all, and they're like, no, you have to be here at 9 and you have to work till 5. You have to ask those questions and be aware of what you're getting yourself into.
That's really good. Thank you so much. Any other insights from other people?
Yeah, that's a really tough question when you're talking about balancing kind of on one hand, like when something keeps failing and you're working really hard, but you kind of can't make it work and your supervisor wants you to do it a certain way though. And on the other hand, also I often experience where my supervisor has one vision and I have another one. So I'm really interested in something and it's working so well. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I want to do this more. But my supervisor says, no, that's not really relevant. I want you to do this instead. And it's always going to be a balancing act, and it depends on your supervisor and your style. I know for me, I like to kind of try and combine a little bit of both. So my supervisor will often kind of say, I want it to be done this way, and this is kind of how you should do it. And I always like to kind of do that, because you obviously you have to do, at the end of the day, your supervisor is in charge. So you can't just say, oh no, I'm not going to do that. So it's important, even if you don't necessarily think that's the best, but a good way to navigate that, I find, is to kind of do it the way your supervisor suggests and try some other things and kind of put the data together. And you're not trying to tell your supervisor they're right or wrong, but like if you are able to do it, if you're able to kind of try a few different things and put the data together and put a really good presentation together. And that's why I mentioned like making PowerPoint slides when you're having a meeting with your supervisor and showing the data there. It's a lot easier to say, I've tried these different things, this is the outcome, and they can kind of see that and make decisions for themselves, rather than you just coming to them and say, oh no, that's wrong, it's not going to work. Because yeah, I guess you have to think about it as, if you're the supervisor, sure, you may feel like your supervisor is stuck in their ways and not really understanding something, but when you're not seeing the result, so supervisors are generally a lot like very reasonable people, but sometimes you have to remember that they don't see what you're doing day to day and what works and what doesn't work. So as a grad student, you're a smart person, and you might be more of an expert in the very specific thing you're doing than your supervisor. Your supervisor is an expert in the field, but you're spending every day reading papers and working on a very small niche area of that field. So you should have confidence in your own knowledge. And it's not about proving anyone wrong or you're right, I'm wrong. But it's just showing the data and giving the context that helps you work together, I think.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
I was gonna, by the way, just like one note for people. I would say I've just realized all of this advice is specific to like Canadian university, the big labs in like Harvard and MIT. You may never talk to the supervisor. You may talk to him once. It's a different structure in which big labs that have like 50 people in it, you're under the watch of a postdoc, and then so there's no labs like that I know, at least within UofT. But if you are thinking to branch out and start going to these really huge, well-known labs, it may be a completely different structure, and then you have to do your research and maybe like emailing a postdoc or a grad student there to ask what the hierarchy is in the lab, and if you're going to get a lot of face-to-face time with the supervisor, because that's not always guaranteed when you have these like 50 plus people labs.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I actually had a couple friends who did that. So no, that's a really good call. Thank you for making that. Okay, so we are really close to time. So I do want to mention a couple last minute things. Shreya, I see you've already sent it. So I'm gonna pass it over to you, and then I guess you can make your closing remarks.
Yeah, for sure. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much to all our speakers again for taking the time out of your day and educating all of us, all of our undergraduate students at U of T. This was really informative, and I think most of us are really interested in research, and this kind of gave us like a really good segue into applying for whether it's like a summer position, a thesis position, or even if people are in fourth year for a master's position. So thank you all so much for that. I would like everyone who is here to fill out the feedback form that is in the chat. That would just help us to improve our future events at UT BIOME. And if you guys want to join UT BIOME, you can go to our Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or even our website, which is listed here. And then if you want to join our general membership, you can scan the QR code or even go to the sign up form, which I think Khadija can link or send you via email after. So thank you all so much for coming out. I hope this was a very informative event for all of you, and I hope you guys come out to future events presented by UT BIOME.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to all of our speakers for your time. Honestly, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. And I'm sure if anyone ever wants to reach out to any of us, like feel free to send us an email. I know we'll all be happy to answer questions or chat about research.
I agree with that.
Thanks
and thank you
for
for the organizers for inviting us and hosting this and putting the work into creating it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Good night, guys.